Thank you so much again for tuning into the third AI Here and There event, which today is focused on probably the most important topic above all, health. My name is Mona Sloane. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a sociologist at New York University, where I work on inequality in the context of AI design and policy. I'm a senior research scientist at NYU's New Center for Responsible AI, and I also teach at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, and I'm a fellow with the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. This event today is part of the AI Here and There series that we at the Center for Responsible AI have been organizing in partnership with a fantastic team at the Swiss Consulate in New York City. We've been having a lot of fun with this project. We've learned a lot, and we're happy that you are here with us today. Before we get going and before I introduce both the topic and our stellar panel, please be reminded that this meeting is being recorded. And please let me also acknowledge that I am standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples here in New York City. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, I want to shift to the focus of our conversation today, the intersection of artificial intelligence and health. Now, the systems that we call artificial intelligence or AI at this point are very deeply entangled with how we frame and understand the human body and how we care for human bodies. And this influence really extends beyond the healthcare sector. These systems can, in fact, be seen as affecting health or public health more broadly in various ways. And we'll be talking about that. Like in many other sectors, AI in the context of health is often used for its prediction function. And when we talk about AI in the sense of machine learning, we can sometimes enter what has been called the machine learning loop. And I'm giving you that backdrop so we can jump off it for our conversation. For machine learning processes to work, the state of the world is measured. To generate data, for example, data on how care needs of patients with certain diseases unfold. A mathematical model is then trained based on this data, whereby the learning process means that the model learns by way of summarizing patterns in the training data to make generalizations for predictions, which aids decision-making. These decisions impact individuals, which is kind of often hard to measure too. And this impact is then fed back into the model. And so the wheel spins around. Now, what is important to remember is that this loop can have adverse effects on the health of certain populations. For example, populations who have historically been excluded, ignored, abused, or neglected by healthcare systems, and who can be absent from data sets. But this is sort of one area in which AI is applied in terms of machine learning. AI systems are also used to speed up clinical research and drug discovery, and we are at this point all intimately familiar with how important that can be. AI systems are also used in so-called precision medicine, which seeks to develop individualized health insights. It is used in diagnostics. For example, computer vision technologies are used in radiology to help detect tumors and scans. Other systems can help medical staff, doctors and nurses transcribe their notes effectively. This is actually big business. Just last week, Microsoft announced the $19 billion acquisition of a company called Nuance, which is a speed recognition firm that can grasp the very specialized language of medicine. Now, as you can see, AI and health is a very hot topic, and we have leading experts from both Switzerland and the US on the panel today to tell us more about it. So without further ado, please let me introduce our speakers today. Dr. Khadija Ferryman, Ambassador Amandip Gill, Dr. Ziad Obermeyer, and Dr. Philippe Menu. Khadija Ferryman is a cultural anthropologist and bioethicist who studies the social, cultural, and ethical implications of health information technologies. She is currently industry assistant professor at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, as well as a Mozilla Open Science Fellow and an affiliate at the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. At the Data and Society Research Institute in New York, she led as a postdoc the Fairness in Precision Medicine research study, which examines the potential for bias and discrimination in predictive precision medicine. Dr. Ferryman has published in research journals such as Pediatric and Perinatal Epidemiology, the Journal of Healthcare for the Poor and Underserved, European Journal of Human Genetics, and Genetics in Medicine. Her research has been featured in many publications, including Nature, STAT, and the Financial Times. She has a BA in anthropology from Yale University and a PhD in anthropology from the New School for Social Research. Welcome, Khadija, and thank you so much for joining us today. Also on the panel is Ambassador Amandeep Gill, who is the project director and CEO of the International Digital Health and AI Research Collaborative, a Geneva-based global platform for enabling inclusive, impactful, and responsible research into digital health and AI for health. He is the former executive director and co-lead of the Secretariat of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. He previously served as India's ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and chaired the group of governmental experts of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons on Emerging Technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapons systems. Ambassador Gill has a BTech in Electronics and Electrocommunications from Punjab University, Kandiak, and is an advanced diploma in French history and language from Geneva University. His PhD degree from King's College London focused on nuclear learning and multilateral forums. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Then, also on the panel from the West Coast, Dr. Ziad Obermeyer is the Blue Cross of California Distinguished Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, where he does research at the intersection of machine learning, medicine, and health policy. He previously was an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, where he received an Early Independence Award, the National Institutes of Health's most prestigious award for exceptional junior scientists. He continues to practice emergency medicine in underserved parts of the US. And prior to his career in medicine, he worked as a consultant to pharmaceutical and global health clients at McKinsey & Co. in New Jersey, Geneva, and Tokyo. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us from the other side of the country. Across the pond, joining us from Europe is Dr. Philippe Menu, who is Chief Medical Officer of Sophia Genetics, a global leader in data-driven medicine, which brings a unique blend of medical expertise across clinical medicine, fundamental research in molecular biology, and business management consulting. He joined Sophia Genetics in 2020 from McKinsey, where he had spent the last 8 years serving dozens of clients in the biopharma sector, advising global pharmaceutical companies, mid-sized players, and biotechs alike across the pharma value chain, with a major focus on innovative therapies and diagnostics in oncology and rare diseases. He obtained his MD and PhD from the University of Lausanne and his MBA in life science from the Open University Business School. Welcome all. Thank you, Philippe, for joining us. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you. Few words in housekeeping. We will be having a panel discussion. Meanwhile, please pop your questions as they pop into your head into the Q&A part, and we will take these on in the Q&A part of the event, which will start about 12:40. Now, I would like to start our conversation with the different directions that AI innovation can take in the context of health. And I would love to start with you, Khadija. I spoke a little bit about the focus areas of AI-driven healthcare systems and health systems. A lot is focused on risk prediction, but also disease identification. How can and should AI intervene in aspects of health outside of these domains, especially if it is to be fair?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mona, and thank you for the lovely introduction. So I have a couple of thoughts on this question of thinking about AI development outside of risk prediction and disease diagnosis. I mean, the first thing I would say would be that it's important that we do get risk prediction and diagnosis right. In terms of making sure that those are accurate and, of course, as unbiased as they can be, as well as that to make sure that those functions are not exacerbating health inequalities. So I would say for me, I think one of the most important aspects is to make sure that these tools are just more than fair, because we have talked about how kind of fairness can have different meanings. And for me, I think switching from sort of thinking about fairness to justice is how we can think about these tools being beneficial for everyone. But outside of risk prediction and identification, I think there really are some interesting areas of development for these tools in medicine. And one is sort of thinking about actually how, not just how these tools can how these tools, cannot exacerbate health disparities, but actually how we can use these tools to actually help us learn new things about health disparities and health inequities that happen in the course of healthcare. And my colleagues Marzia Gassimian and Irene Chen have been doing some really interesting work actually looking at how AI in health can be used to diagnose health disparities, if you will, or shed light on sort of new ways that health disparities emerge in the context of medical care. So I think that is a really interesting area of development. They kind of phrase it as using AI in health to help kind of diagnose health inequities. So that I think is a promising area. Another promising area of development, or how we can think about using AI tools in health outside of risk prediction and disease detection, is comes from two of my colleagues from the Data and Society Research Institute, Madeline Ellish and Elizabeth Watkins, who have done some really interesting work looking at how the implementation of AI tools in medical systems sort of impact medical hierarchies. So they've done some really interesting ethnographic research about what happens when AI tools are actually implemented on the ground, and how those sort of expose hierarchies that impact workflows when any new technology is introduced into the healthcare setting, and how AI tools in particular, because they are sort of a source of expertise, sort of upend and shift medical hierarchies in medical settings in sort of interesting ways. And they talk about how some of these tools sort of prompt what they call repair work for different, for nurses in particular in the healthcare setting. So I think these tools can actually be a really interesting, can help us sort of understand hierarchies within clinical settings in new and interesting ways. And finally, I think that AI and machine learning in health can also provide some really interesting ways, some really interesting cases for helping us understand the process of racialization itself and how racialization happens in clinical care and in healthcare in general. So it's not just thinking about how health equities are, how health inequities are exacerbated, but actually how racial hierarchies are actually created and circulated in the health in the course of sort of health and medicine. So, for example, how does health data become racialized, and how do we learn about the way that categories of race and ethnicity and these different ways that we categorize people, they're not stable. Those categories change over the years, and actually the development of these tools and through processes of labeling data, bringing together disparate data sets, can actually tell us some really interesting things about how racialization happens and changes and how it interacts in medicine. So those are, I think, are some interesting ways to sort of think about the use of AI in medicine outside of risk prediction, or in addition to risk prediction and disease diagnosis.
Thank you so much, Khadija. I really appreciate these sort of 4 points that can very well serve as a backdrop for our conversation today. Now, speaking about research, Ambassador Jill, you have global experience with the topic of digital health, and the project you're leading is focused on creating platforms for research on that. How can we begin to think about democratization of opportunity in digital health, sort of taking Khadijah's points as a cue, specifically with a view for the global south.
Thank you very much. So I'll be happy to continue where Khadija left off, um, and give you three live examples from the collaborative research projects that we are pursuing. The first one is something we call a global research map. So using a mix of AI technologies to map the technology landscape. So going through all the patent and non-patent literature that's out there to understand the digital health and AI in health landscape, understand the taxonomies of the technology field, and different levels of maturity, and then validating what we learn through the AI based techniques with 9 regional consultations. So looking at the world in 9 different regions, 3 of those regions being in Africa, to validate the taxonomy that the AI is throwing up. So this kind of an analog digital play in terms of understanding the technology field is one area. And obviously this has a deeper equity, reducing the asymmetries in knowledge making agenda. Because if you don't understand what's happening and what are the trends, then who's where, then you are not able to respond to it in policy terms with investment strategies, etc. The other example is the collaborative development of a decision support tool, a clinical decision support tool on prescribing antibiotics. And we all know that the antimicrobial resistance AMR pandemic is very serious. It's likely to cause a large number of deaths in the future as the antibiotics pipeline dries up. And we've made a mess of One Health with overprescription of antibiotics for animals and humans. So in a particular contextual setting, we are bringing together a shared appreciation of the problem, a shared research design, but distributed data sets for collaborative AI development. So you have data sets in a hospital in India, another in a hospital in Singapore, a third one in Africa. So the researchers are collaborating on a shared research design so that they have trust in each other's data architectures and the quality of each other's data sets. And then they together build an AI. It's again an attempt at reducing the inequity that one geography develops the code and the other just contributes data. And so this is something that we're trying to change. And then when you have an outcome, there's more trust in that outcome because you have built it together. The last example I'll give is the use of digital and AI technologies to develop EPROMs. So these are electronic patient reported outcome metrics. So in NCDs, in mental health, you have a lot of questionnaires which are often not very scientific. They've been developed scientifically, but the way they are administered, there are biases in them, there are errors in them. So generating live questionnaires using AI in particular contextual situations that are easy to administer for the health worker, easy to understand for the patient, and that create a kind of secure, well-governed data set that helps follow the patient's progress over a period of time. I just conclude by saying that IDEA's big focus is on flattening the knowledge-making landscape, bringing more attention on networks, needs, and opportunities in emerging geographies of innovation, where there is a lot of excitement about the digital transformation, the paper to digital to AI transition, but often the capacity is lacking, the appreciation of the value of data is lacking, basic things like the digital infrastructure for research into digital health and AI in health is not this. We're trying to change the equation on that through our work.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I really appreciate those points, and especially the notion about flattening the knowledge making process, sort of generally, in thinking about how that can be done. Zia, you are a researcher and AI expert, but also a medical practitioner, and sort of speaking, about health inequities and speaking about good quality data. Ambassador Jill's point of, flat hierarchies, counting lived experience as expertise as well. Sometimes we see big AI systems and big, I deliberately use that word. We see them fail in situations in the wild. There are many examples, but sort of more recently, the Stanford University vaccine allocation algorithm comes to mind. What are kind of areas of application that you see as promising in the AI and health field?
Yeah, maybe what I can do is I'll tell you about one project that I worked on with some colleagues, and I think that really ties together both the answer to your question about where the promise is with some of the things that Khadija and Amandeep raised, which was around both. What do we mean by diagnosis? How does race get into the data sets that we use? And then how do we democratize that, the data making process, the representation of people's experiences and expertises? So we were interested in this fact, which is very widely known in the pain literature, but not elsewhere, which is that the distribution of the pain that people experience is very different depending on your race, depending on your socioeconomic status, depending on your education. And a very robust but mysterious finding is that if you take two patients whose knees look the same on an X-ray in terms of the degree of arthritis that they have in the knee, for example, a Black patient in the US on average will report far more pain from that knee than a white patient. And so this is a really tragic fact. It's a very mysterious one as well, that many people have tried to explain by citing factors like stress or psychosomatic representation of depression or anxiety as pain, or lots of other things. And I think there's a lot of good research on that. And I think that's been very valuable. But we were interested in a different explanation, which is, what if there was actually something in those patients' knees that was producing the pain, and it was not a function of stress or psychosomatic illness? So what we did is we trained a machine learning algorithm, but not in the usual way. So the usual machine learning playbook in this area is to get a bunch of X-rays, get what the radiologist, what the doctor said about those X-rays, and automate that process. So train the algorithm to learn from the doctor. If we're worried, though, that doctors might be missing causes of pain in the knee that are affecting disproportionately Black patients or lower education, socioeconomic status patients, that's exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want the algorithm to mirror the errors and biases of the human who's looking at that X-ray. So what we did instead, and this goes back to the point about patient-reported outcomes, is we trained the algorithm not to learn from the doctor, but to listen to the patient. So rather than predicting what the doctor says about the knee, we predicted what the patient's rating of pain from that knee was. And that helped the algorithm actually find new causes of pain that the radiologists were missing. And so I think there are a couple of really interesting lessons about that story. One is reinforcing that point that we need data sets that represent the patient's experience and the real clinical outcomes of people, not just what the doctor says. If we train the algorithm just on what the doctor says, or in general on health care rather than health, we're going to mirror and augment all of the biases that exist in those data already. By contrast, if we can have data sets that represent these really important clinical outcomes, what patients say about their experience, we can actually use algorithms to make new discoveries about what's causing pain, what to do about it, who needs physical therapy or a knee replacement for their knee, and whose pain is coming from somewhere else. So I think that's one point. And the other point is that, I think that we are very worried about bias getting into algorithms. And I think sometimes that leads to a perspective that is, almost like giving up. Like, we train algorithms on biased data, and biased data comes from a biased society. And until we fix the bias in society, we can't have unbiased algorithms. And I actually don't think that's true. I think that by picking the algorithm's target very carefully, so listening to the patient rather than listening to the doctor, we can actually have algorithms that help us along in that process of creating a more just society, because those algorithms can see things that humans are missing. They can redirect our attention and our resources to people who need help, not people who are already getting help. And so I think that, for me, I couldn't agree more with some of the themes that that you raised initially, Mona, in your comments about, to predict something, first it has to be measured. We need to be sure that we're measuring the right things, and we need to make sure that the right people have access to those data. And so I wanted to mention one effort that we're engaged in, which is with philanthropic support from Schmidt Futures, from the Moore Foundation, from others. We're building open data sets for machine learning research. So we work with health systems to produce these kinds of data sets, like x-rays linked not just to the radiologist's reading, but to the patient experience. We put those up on our platform and we make them available for nonprofit researchers, and it's called Nightingale Open Science. Ambassador Gill, I would love to talk to you later about how we can potentially work together, because it sounds like some of our objectives are very aligned.
Thank you so much, Ziad. And it's wonderful to hear sort of concrete examples about how AI can actually be used, as a way to learn and then sort of initiate change. So, shifting attention and resource to sort of the whole or the wide spectrum of stakeholders involved. So it was very interesting to hear how that's actually done. But I would sort of stay with the theme of data sets and large scale data sets, which sort of cut across all three points that were made today. And Philip, I would love to turn to you, because that's sort of your area of expertise. We have availability of large scale data sets. We have increased computational power, and we have increased analytical capacity of systems. There is vast potential. I think we can all agree on that. But we kind of need to make systems speak to one another, right? We need to think about interfaces a little bit. And so my question for you would be, what role could AI play in standardizing health data, and how important is it to think about standardization?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mona, and fascinating discussion so far. So I'm really glad to be part of that. Maybe 2 words on what Sophia is, so you understand where I'm coming from in terms of the context, right? So we're a global health tech company. We're essentially a cloud-based platform that computes digital health data from any origin. But we have a particularity, which is we're decentralized, right? So we really push the analytics to the sites, and our mission is to democratize data-driven medicine. And by that, we mean basically exactly along the lines we discussed, generate insights from data, but in a democratized way, which is making sure that the algos travel to the places where they need it most, and so that you have the same quality of insights whether you sit in Boston and Harvard, or within Africa, or in Paris, right? So what we do is we then decentralize the analytics, we standardize the data as it's being generated on the platform on a global scale, and then we basically aggregate insights and we share the insights with a network of customers. So we create a collective intelligence in the process. How do we fit in the discussion? I think in the last few years, maybe a decade, we've seen 2 huge revolutions in healthcare. One, just data production, not just like volumes of data, but new types and modalities of data. We went through the genomics revolution that led to wonderful advances in oncology treatment with targeted therapy, for example. But more and more, we're producing new kinds of data, right? So for example, now with radiomics, we have millions and millions of scans, whether it's CT scans, MRI, PET scans being produced everywhere around the world on a yearly basis. Today, this data is actually not really leveraged, right? We basically do a qualitative assessment, radiologist looks at it, makes their diagnosis and then closes it. Same thing for pathology slides, right? We have millions of pathology slides laying around, people look at it under the microscope, they make a determination and leave it be. Now with AI, what we can do is we can really analyze these images that are really existing already and generate completely novel data stacks from these images. The AI can basically go into an image of an MRI of a lung patient, for example, goes in, segments the tumor, does essentially a radiomics features extraction, and you generate new data that wasn't simply there before. So that's the first thing. Second thing is where the huge revolution around AI capabilities, right? Machine learning algorithm that allows you with tech recipes now to make sense of these large scale data sets at scale. And the point is, when you combine a deep understanding of biology with the tech recipes, you can basically take these big multimodal data sets, combining for the same patient genomics, radiomics, digital pathology, clinical outcomes. You basically build that patient tower of data if you want, and then you compare it to other patients in the network. And with machine learning, you can essentially ask the algos to tell you, as Philippe, as a lung cancer patient, with this multimodal fingerprint I have across all of these data modalities, what am I supposed to take in terms of therapies, right? And we are now getting closer to the day where you can make an individual prediction of response to therapy or disease progression for a patient that is really in front of you, and not just like based on statistic, you have 60% of chances of responding to therapy. And I think that your use of AI here is obviously critical, because without that, we couldn't do the analytics. But I would say it also helps, in a way, address these inequalities we were mentioning before. A big challenge we have in pharma today is that we're prescribing drugs to millions of patients based on randomized clinical trials that have been done in ideal patients, in ideal circumstances. So lung cancer immunotherapy, you will not see a lot of data on older patients, sicker patients, racial minorities, because they are typically not well recruited in those clinical trials because of the footprint. And so if you can get large enough data sets, high quality data sets, but large enough from every part of the world, AI can really learn from that data. And to your point before, if we can, as much as possible, unbias that data, at least AI can really look at the real world patient in their entire diversity and then tell you, okay, that patient looking like this really has a better chance of getting benefit from that therapy A versus B. So I think for us, it's clear that in the coming years, there will be a massive revolution of using AI in the clinic to make clinical decision support. A big question is going to be, what do you need to produce in terms of evidence to convince these doctors and physicians in the future to actually trust the algos and go along with the recommendations in a way.
Thank you so much, Philippe, for that fascinating and real world insight on that, especially with new types of data that's now available. And that's sort of how we can fold that into the learning process that we just spoke about. Speaking of trust, you mentioned this, Philippe. Trust is important, and trust is sort of a social thing that we do as humans, right? But it's also a thing that has increasingly attracted policy attention. AI systems and trust is something that regulators are focused on. And just last week, we saw the leak of the new AI regulation that's going to come out of the European Commission. I believe tomorrow is the big day that focuses on that too. And so I want to ask a couple of questions about equity, governance, policy, regulation. How can we get these things, on the road? And Khadija, we kind of spoke a little bit about how AI tools can be designed proactively to address health disparities. You spoke about that, but what would that mean in terms of process, in terms of who is involved? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the regulators? The FTC put a blog post out yesterday and said, gave a sort of a clear direction as to what they would look at and what accountability means. And really, what's the timeline? And how can we do this in a way to address health inequities, especially as we've seen them, in the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And, I have a couple of thoughts. So here in the US, we have the Food and Drug Administration that has proposed some kind of initial guidance for regulating AI in health, and has sort of proposed a number of steps for how to regulate the use of these tools. And one of the things that I see kind of lacking in the proposed regulations right now is this intentional attention to health disparities and attention to how do we ensure that these tools, as part of our regulatory process, are advancing health equity, right? So, and I think that when that question becomes central, then the regulation looks different. So, for example, in the proposed regulations here in the US, there is some guidance around AI developers should have good machine learning practices. But there isn't, for example, right now a requirement that they, as part of their good practices and their sort of good kind of culture, organizational culture, for example, that they demonstrate a knowledge of the health disparities in the domain of interest. So in the kind of field that they're developing their technology, how are they demonstrating attention to health disparities? That's one. In other steps along the process of developing these tools, again, in the regulation, there's some guidance for sort of being transparent about the decisions that are made in the course of model development. But again, there is an attention to, well, be transparent about the decisions, but also how might these different technical decisions and sort of ways that the model is being calibrated, let's say, how might those decisions have impacts on different groups or impacts on health disparities in this particular clinical domain that the tool is being used for, right? So it's not just kind of the technical decisions around how to calibrate the model, but how those technical decisions could have impacts on health equity. So those are some of the things that I think are missing from the regulation as it's proposed today in the US that could be included, as well as sort of the post-market process. So once these tools have been developed and initially approved, there is a process of sort of post-market regulation, how the tool, as you mentioned before, how it's sort of doing in the wild, and how, again, do we think about that post-market regulation as not just as, is the tool performing as it said it would? Is it as accurate as it said it would be? But again, are we seeing any health equity implications? Are we seeing that the tool is being used more or less often in particular groups? Are we seeing that this tool is having an impact on health disparities? How and why? So those are some questions that I think even once the tool has been approved or sort of gone through the regulatory process, that we can continue to ask these questions about health equity in that policy process. And also throughout, I think it's really important to include, we've been talking about inclusion of broad stakeholders, things like having kind of more open data, bringing people in from different geographic regions. I think that also including broadening the sort of stakeholders and having that be an explicit part of policy is also really important. So again, there's some really interesting work being done right now of sort of collaborative model development and how you can actually bring people into processes of developing models, right? Even if people don't necessarily have a technical background. We've seen AI researchers sort of using some of the principles of kind of inclusive design or participatory design to the development of their machine learning models. So could that be something that's part of AI and health regulation that could, again, serve this end of ensuring that these tools proactively advance health equity? And then just thinking about kind of in addition to broadening the stakeholders and broadening and kind of asking questions about health equity throughout the process of model development as part of regulating these tools, I think it's also important to think about a kind of broader universe of regulators. So in the US, the FDA has sort of taken the lead on regulating AI in health, but we can also think about roles of other potential regulators. So for example, here in the US, Center for Medicaid is, sort of a de facto regulator because they are a payer and reimburse for many medical services. And so could there be a way that, advancing health equity is connected to goals of, value-based care that would get payers interested in making sure that the regulation sort of reflects a focus on advancing health equity, for example. So I think there's other ways to again sort of bring in payers, again potentially as de facto regulators or as entities that can influence policy, the development of policy to ensure that priorities like health equity are central.
Thank you so much, Khadija, for that, for those great points, and also kind of hinting at how doing this in the health, in the context of health, can possibly serve to inform other areas of application when it comes to AI. And it's going to be exciting to see that new regulation drop this week and see what's going to happen. But I want to shift a little bit towards governance. And Ambassador Jill, I would love to ask you about the ways in which, or about the approaches that can help overcome some of the digital health and AI governance challenges that we are seeing today.
Right. So, I mean, this is trivial that there's a difference between governance and regulation, and trust is something very, very different, So the challenge today, before I come to health, is that one, we're using tools from the 19th century and 20th century to regulate emerging technologies, in particular AI. The notions of smart regulation, multi-stakeholder regulation, agile regulation is still to kind of be mainstream. The other challenge is there's a surfeit of abstraction. So there are 90 plus initiatives on AI principles, for example, and then many of these are looked at very broadly, as if this could apply to each and every field. So we are already making progress when we get down to a specific domain like health. And there's a great question in the chat about, does bias work the same way in health as it does in education or law enforcement? So we're making progress. But I think when it comes to governance more concretely, we would need to look at one tiered approach to governance. So there's a role for these international norms, possibly a treaty or something, although treaty making is very difficult these days in some areas. Let's say on lethal autonomous weapon systems, for example, someday you might have something like and then there is the national, regional regulatory landscape. But you mentioned the new EU regulation that's been leaked, and it is part of a set of EU initiatives that have followed the EU leadership on GDPR. So there is a role there, a big role for national, regional regulation. And a lot of countries are moving into legal frameworks and so on. And then there is a third tier, which is where the industry is more active, where standards and industry understandings make a lot of sense. And then there needs to be some agility even within these tiers. So you have to have feedback from the practice that helps you improve your governance responses. So reduce the pacing problem between technology and policy, but also make governance reflect more the practice on the ground. And that way you also kind of come in on the early cycle of tech development, because traditional regulation is about products and services that are rolled out. And we have a particular challenge with AI because the tool might learn on the fly. So when do you wheel it back to be re-regulated? Or you bring in something else that's more agile. So this kind of a live feedback is important. This kind of innovation is important. In our work on research governance in particular, so I'm not talking about very broad policy governance, we've been looking at this kind of a three-piece mechanism where you have stakeholder engagement, where you have the discovery of the governing norms in a particular context. So what kind of principles apply? What kind of the legislative acquis, the existing legal injunctions apply in this particular domain? And the third piece is the solutions exchange, where you kind of share governance innovation in a sense. And so governance needs to make the solutions exchange work. Otherwise, it's just stifling. I mean, this is one of the criticism that's often laid at the door of EU regulation, that it's very top down, doesn't leave enough room for innovation. So there's a way to kind of square the circle.
Thank you so much for introducing the three-tiered approach. And I'd be, in a separate conversation, very curious to hear about the more local focus, because that's something we're seeing here in the US, that cities are actually taking decided steps towards very localized AI regulation, not yet in the context of health, but other areas such as criminal justice. But I would love to stick with the practitioners. And Ziad, you are a practitioner, you are a data scientist, or a machine learning expert, and so I'd be curious to hear from you. How do practitioners think about policy and regulation and sort of maybe organizational governance of these tools, sort of, in context? I'm thinking, emergency room, for example.
I think, that there's, of course, an enormous amount of enthusiasm for these tools in the health systems, the people who pay for healthcare, tech companies, and I think that often butts up against the regulatory apparatus in sometimes unproductive ways, where people get frustrated because they feel like regulation is going to slow them down. And so I think maybe the place to start is, we often just assume that we need regulation of things, but why is that the case here? So I just want to give you one fact from one of our papers that we published a couple of years ago, which looked at a set of algorithms that are used by almost every health system in the US and almost every insurer, that tries to find patients who are in need of extra help with their chronic conditions. And so, this helps health systems decide on who gets access to these programs that are like a VIP program for complex patients. There's a special phone line, there's extra primary care, there's just a lot of help. And what we found is that the algorithms that are used to allocate that extra help resource are very biased. They prioritize healthier white patients ahead of less healthy Black patients for extra help with their health. The degree of bias was very large. So one estimate that we produced was that in a high priority group that should have gotten access to this, it was 17% Black, when it should have been, in an unbiased world, about 48% Black. So it was a very large degree of bias. And I think it's important to point out that nobody caught that in the market. All of the companies and academic groups and government agencies who produce these algorithms did not catch it. The health systems who bought the algorithm didn't catch it. The doctors and patients whose care was affected did not catch it. So I think there's just like this clear market failure in terms of catching and preventing this harm. And this particular piece of software that we use, that's used to make decisions for 70 million people every year in the US. The family of algorithms, the industry estimates are around 150 to 200 million people per year. Similar algorithms are being used in Europe and in other places. So there is just this failure of the market to catch biased products before they get into very wide use. And I think that is the case for regulating these algorithms in some form. Now, I think that the concerns from industry and from health systems are also real. We actually really need algorithms. The quality of many of the important decisions that we make, for example, who needs extra help, is not as high as it could be, and algorithms could really help. And so I think the challenge for regulation is, how do you balance those two things? You cannot have draconian regulation that stifles innovation in this space. You cannot have regulation that prevents anyone from ever touching someone's data to train these algorithms without getting millions of people's individual consent. That's just not the correct way to move forward, because we actually do need these tools to improve the quality and the efficiency of our healthcare. So I think that what I've been working on a lot with state and federal regulators in the US is how to strike that balance, how to provide guidance for industry about what is bias, what do we mean by it, how do we define an unbiased algorithm for the setting that you're using, so that we can prevent these kinds of things from happening, but also how do we craft regulation that does not compromise trade secrets, that is able to be audited from the outside without opening up the black box and requiring a lot of disclosure. There's a lot of precedent that we can learn from the financial services industry, where similar products are regulated very effectively with good record keeping and good retrospective audits. And so I think that, you know, striking that balance is really, really important to balance these two competing goals of wanting to take advantage of this really productive innovation, but also wanting to minimize the harms.
Thank you so much, Sia, for that take, and I'm so excited that you said record keeping, because I think that personally, I think that's gonna be something we're gonna see so much more.
Oh yeah, and I think it's actually right now very shocking how poorly the records are being kept. So I'm participating in one investigation where the algorithm design has not, the records of the design have not been maintained. There were all sorts of human fiddling with the algorithm ex post that only, you know, Bob from IT, who left 5 years ago, knows about. So it is just shocking how poorly these records are kept, and it's not going to be a good look when those algorithms are investigated for bias. It is disastrous for the companies involved.
Yeah, and that's yet another argument for sort of a more interdisciplinary sort of take on how we think about how these systems are embedded into our social world. But I would love to throw it over to Philip for the sort of last comment today before we take the question that we have in the Q&A chat. Philip, I think it's fair to say that AI is here to stay. And we spoke about that a fair bit today. What are the implications of that? And how do you see sort of the future of AI and health unfolding over the next 3, 5, and then 10 years?
You know, I think it's pretty obvious to everyone, and frankly, not shocking to say that AI is going to be here to stay, right? Frankly, because with the gigantic amount of data, there's simply no other way to make sense of it and really extract the most value. But I think you have a couple of very important upstream and downstream considerations. So upstream, we discussed about regulations, but even before that, there's the whole discussion about, you know, data availability and quality, right? So today data is siloed, fragmented, variable quality across many, many different sites across the world, right? So how do you standardize that data is a key point. Second, that data typically is not really shared today widely because of data privacy, going back to regulation. So how do we encourage actually not only generating high quality data, but we can share it and generate insights and build a real collective intelligence. And the last one is really going to Ziad's point about the analytics, right? So making sure that we have the right ways to look at the data in a way that's unbiased and maximizes the value that's in the data. These things are infrastructure, right? But if you go back in time under the Obama administration, then Vice President Biden led the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. And a part of that, one of the big priorities was data infrastructure. I think we're making progress, but by far not enough, right? To really unlock the absolute gigantic value that we have to make progress there. And if you switch, you know, to kind of the future state, the question is, what's going to be the impact at the end, right? Because you can see a world in which 20 years from now, every morning you take a blood drop, you put it in your machine at home. It basically does remote monitoring of your liquid biopsy. You know, you see if you have markers of cancer, or frankly, if glucose is going up and diabetes could be appearing. And then you have this whole AI automated, the way we are thinking about, you know, automating car driving. It could be a bit of an automated medicine in a way, right? If you want. That also calls into question, you know, the role of the healthcare practitioner and the physicians in the future. And what do we think about training these people, right? As we start pumping out AI algorithms, what does it take for physicians to be comfortable, again, trusting the results that they would actually make a prediction and they would use that prediction to do something for their patient that may be counterintuitive for them, for example. You know, in medical schools 10 years from now, will we see AI classes, for example, right? Where it's less about learning everything yourself, but more learning about data analytics because you think there's going to be an AI model in the future that will do all of this computation for you. And your role as a doctor is not to know every single one of these data points because you won't be able to at all, for sure. There will be just too many, but more interpreting and then freeing up your time to actually care more for the patient on a human basis, right? So do you have like computer assisted kind of knowledge so that you can more connect with humans on a more fundamental level where today, you know, they're just running around finding radiographies, writing report, all of that can be automated in the future. So, you know, I think a generation ago, we discovered DNA, right? Which basically transformed completely healthcare in ways that we were not imagining at the time for sure. And you have to wonder whether in a generation from now, people just turn around and say, you know, this era of 2010 to 2020, that was really the start, the stone age of AI, and look how the world has evolved completely since then, right? That was really the stone age, poor them. They were grappling with very basics. And the question is, for our children, how do we actually make sure that we have the right data available, we share it unbiased way, we have the right algos, we have people who can actually understand, learn from the data, and actually do something positive out of this. And I think from regulation, education, access to care, there's so many like gigantic, construction works that open when you think about that. It's fantastic, but there's a lot of work to do for sure for everyone around the table. Right?
Thank you. What a wonderful sort of rounding comment for the panel section. We have a couple of minutes left, and I would love to take the one question that we have in the chat. And I think this is probably a good one for Khadija and Ambassador Jill. So we have a question that says, unlike hiring in criminal justice systems, equality in healthcare AI should mean something different. For example, an AI health algorithm that works well in Boston should actually not work similarly in Africa or in India, given the geographical differences and, more importantly, the biological and genetic differences among humans. Hence, how important is it to incorporate context into the idea of debiasing health AI? Do context-aware AI systems and fair AI systems within the health domain go hand in hand? Khadija, maybe if you could take a stab at this one.
Sure. So there were a couple of parts of that question, but just out of just thinking about time, I'll address a couple of things. So we've already seen examples of AI tools just being developed using data from kind of being trained using data from one institution that seems like it's representative, and then it's applied or used at another institution and it totally fails, and it's not because the data was incorrect. It was something that had to do with specificities of the data. So for example, there are examples of AI that sort of tuned into the different kinds of machinery that was used, in various ways. And so if the AI model is then used in a different location that uses different kinds of equipment, it's going to not it's not going to be as accurate. So there are a lot of sort of differences within healthcare settings that AI can pick up on and learn, but we just have to, the key issue is sort of figuring out what the AIs are actually picking up on, which I think goes back to some of the points that were made earlier, some of the points made by Ziad, right? It's really important to sort of really have a sense of what the targets are and what the AI is actually learning from, right? Is it actually learning from doctors, or is it actually learning from patients? So what is it actually, what are the signals that are actually being picked up from the data? And I think once we get a better handle on that, that's how we can sort of think about these tools kind of being more mutable mobiles, if you will, like being able to be used in different settings. But again, I think there's also an opportunity for AI to be able to actually tell us some of these interesting differences, right? So it actually is, it's not just a failure of an AI if it's trained on a set of data and then we try it in another healthcare institution and it's not as accurate. It actually can tell us, actually, it's actually kind of an interesting data point in itself that, let's see, why is institution A using equipment in this way and institution B isn't? What can we learn from sort of the differences in how diseases are diagnosed in institutions in Boston versus institutions, in Nairobi, for example, right? So, and I think those kinds of things that the AI can help us kind of identify about, again, kind of activities on the ground, things that happen in clinical care are really interesting and a interesting frontier.
Thank you, Khadija. Learning from difference. Ambassador Jill, would you mind taking a stab at this one too before we close?
Sure. It's a tough one, but let me pick a concrete example. Audio-based triage of COVID-19 patients, so cuff-based audio samples. So and I have personal experience with this example. So the data sets was comprehensive enough, it worked very well in the training phase. But when you actually took it out to the facilities, the medical facilities where the triage was to be done, then the AI was picking up something in the background, classifying something, which kind of made everything go haywire. So I think this is a lesson in humility for all of us who are AI experts. We don't know enough about the human body in particular. These are complex social systems in which we are bringing these, into which we are bringing these technologies. So there will be this distinction between so-called context-aware AI systems and fair AI systems. Our understanding of what is fair will evolve as we discover more and learn more about how AI technologies work and how the human body works. So this is, to be continued in a sense. And debiasing health AI is not going to be just a question of, have the unbiased data sets, develop algorithms in a certain way. It's going to be a much more complex exercise across data, across the algorithms, and across the actual context of deployment and our learnings coming from other fields, molecular science, plain biology, etc.
Thank you so much for that. We are actually at time, a little over time. So I would love to take the opportunity again to thank this distinguished panel, Dr. Khadija Ferryman, Dr. Ziad Obermeyer, Ambassador Amandeep Gill, Dr. Philippe Menu. Thank you so much for your time and energy and your terrific insight today. We really appreciate that you joined the table from different places in the world. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the Swiss network partners who have supported AI here and there throughout, which are the Swiss Business Hub and Swiss Next. And I would like to extend an invitation to all of you who have been watching, as well to our panelists to our last event in the series, which will be held on the 27th at the same time at noon, which will be on artificial intelligence, art and creativity with Karina Popovici, Marnie Bani, Stephanie Dinkins, and Dania Bisek. Thank you so much, everybody. It was a true honor to host you. And thank you to our attendees and to the terrific team, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you so much.